Good evening. My name is Kevin Ring and I'm president of FAMM, formerly Families Against Mandatory Minimums. As our old name suggests, we have a great interest in the topic of tonight's town hall and the mission that lies ahead of us, which is repealing Virginia's counterproductive mandatory minimum sentencing laws. First, I want to thank our co-hosts tonight, Americans for Prosperity Virginia, Ladies of Hope Ministries, and Justice Forward Virginia. Tonight, we're kicking off a nonpartisan, pro-family, pro-public safety campaign to eliminate mandatory minimum sentencing laws in Virginia. We do so because we believe community health and public safety are important values, and that there are better ways to achieve and measure those things than how many people you lock up for how long. Tonight, you'll hear our best case for repealing these ineffective sentencing laws from policymakers, bipartisan advocates, and from directly impacted Virginians. This is not a night only for discussion. We want to take action. So tonight we're releasing a new petition that we hope to share far and wide to demonstrate broad support for repealing mandatory sentences in Virginia, and to build an army of constituents in every legislative district that will become advocates and reach out to their lawmakers and to press for reform. That petition is being shared now in the chat, and I ask you to grab it and sign it at some point tonight, and then share it with your friends and network and family so we can get as big an army as possible, because it's going to take all of us. So let's get started. We have 7 incredible guests that we're going to introduce now. I think one might be running late, but that's okay. What we'll do is then we'll divide into 2 panels, have discussion, questions, and then we'll have everyone come back together, and then we'll take questions from the audience and viewers. So our guests tonight are Senator John Edwards, who represents the 21st District in the Virginia Senate. He serves as chairman of the Judiciary Committee and is our very much appreciated sponsor of legislation to repeal Virginia's mandatory sentences. We're waiting and expect to have soon Commonwealth Attorney for the City of Portsmouth, Stephanie Morales. Ms. Morales has used her position from day one to reform the justice system, to improve community safety, reduce recidivism, and she recently released her first book, a children's book titled The Day I Became a Lawyer. So I'm always happy to plug an author. Andy Elders is a board member and director of Justice Forward Virginia, a criminal justice advocacy group. He is also a practicing public defender in Fairfax. Jacob Fish is Deputy State Director for Americans for Prosperity in Virginia. FAMM has been proud to work with AFP in their chapters in states all around the country, and we're very grateful to have the opportunity to work together in Virginia. We also have Karen Morrison, who's a national advocate with Ladies of Hope Ministries. She has championed the plight of those serving excessive sentences both in Virginia and at the federal level, including the son of our next guest, Lavern Rushin. Lavern, at FAMM, we believe that family members are often the best advocates for their incarcerated loved ones. And Lavern Rushin's tireless and ultimately successful campaign to free her son Matthew is pretty strong proof of that. So thanks for being here. And finally, we welcome Darlene Wells, who proves you don't even have to be a family member to be a tenacious advocate for someone in prison and to see what's wrong with our broken sentencing laws and to fight to fix them. So thanks, Darlene, for your advocacy and for being here. And with that, we're going to start the first panel. So we need Senator Edwards, Jacob Fish, Lavern, and Karen, and the others, if you could turn off your cameras, we'll get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you all for being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this town hall on what I've always thought was a counterproductive part of our criminal justice system, which is mandatory minimum sentencing. First of all, by way of background, I have a little bit of experience in the criminal justice system. I was a JAG officer in the United States Marine Corps, prosecutor, defense attorney, court-martial review officer in the early 70s. I was the United States Attorney for the Western District of Virginia, appointed by President Jimmy Carter, and I served during part of his time and the first part of Reagan. And then I was also chairman of the Virginia Bar Association's criminal law section for a number of years. And I practiced criminal justice system from time to time in the federal system and in the state system. I often thought that the mandatory minimum approach violates what the United States Supreme Court has held back in the 60s, I believe, that criminal sentencing should be based upon two factors. One, the nature and extent of the crime, plus the character and history of the defendant. And it should be particularized and personalized to the particular crime and the person. Mandatory minimum is the opposite of that. It allows the legislature to do the sentencing when they don't know what's going on. They're not involved in the system. They are just putting in what somebody who doesn't know anything about the defendant, doesn't know anything about the crime itself, says this is what needs to be done as a matter of punishment only. And it makes no sense at all. The fact is, in Virginia, we have over 200 mandatory minimum crimes, which is ridiculous. And once you start down that road, it grows and grows and grows. And to the point where Governor Northam has said he's not going to sign any more mandatory minimum laws. And I hope he signs a bill that reduces and maybe abolishes mandatory minimum. The other thing is it's a matter of finances. We could save, according to one study, over $80 million over 5 years and save a lot of lives if we got rid of mandatory minimum sentencing. And the other part is this: it's very discriminatory. I think that 56% of the people in the prison system are Black. Yet we have the average, the African-American population is what, 19% of the entire state. So disproportionately, it affects African-Americans and people of color. And that's pretty well documented. So I think it's time we reform the system, get rid of mandatory minimum sentencing, focus on the crime and the nature of the defendant involved, and not try to make a one-size-fits-all approach, which has been discriminatory and is very unjust, in my opinion. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks for your leadership on this issue. I don't want to get into name calling, but you're a politician. I thought politicians had to support mandatory minimums to appear tough on crime. So how do you do?
I am tough on crime. I am tough on, I'm one of the few people who's been a prosecutor in the General Assembly, as well as a JAG officer, prosecutor, defense attorney, court martial review officer. I've seen it all.
And you do, and what do you say to your colleagues who think that they need mandatories as they have in the past and clung to them as ways of looking tough?
I'll tell them, I prosecuted the largest bank robbery in Virginia history. Have you done that? The largest single to this day, $311,000 bank robbery that I prosecuted and got convictions when I was United States attorney. So yeah, I know how to be tough on crime too. And there's some people that need to be locked up a long time, but most people, that's not the case. But the mandatory minimum approach is a bad way to go.
Thank you for that. I want to talk to Lavern. Lavern, you've experienced firsthand what happens when excessive sentences are used in a way that they really weren't intended because the particular facts of a case weren't allowed to be considered. And so can you talk a little bit about your experience?
Absolutely. Matthew is a Black autistic young man whose processes were never taken into consideration at the accident. There was an accident that was turned into a crime because of his processes. Matthew's never been in trouble. Matthew was a mechanical engineering student at ODU, worked, volunteered throughout our community, was a productive member of our community. So when this happened, it basically just tore our family apart.
Well, Lavern, I'm going to stop you for 1 second. People may not know the story. So if they don't know Matthew's story, can you tell them, what happened and what his sentence was?
Okay, so Matthew got into a car accident about 2 years ago. He was charged with second-degree attempted murder because he repeated what a bystander was saying, which is, I want to kill myself, I want to kill myself. That was never taken into consideration that he had what it was called achalalia. And if you've seen the Dustin Hoffman Rain Man, when Dustin Hoffman kind of repeats himself in a sense of, overload, that was Matthew at that time. So his sensory overload was never taken into consideration. He was charged with second-degree attempted murder. After that, that was dropped. Then they added 2 aggravated malicious wounding charge and a hit and run. Well, with that being said, obviously, he was manipulated into a plea deal, which then dropped the aggravated malicious wounding charge to just malicious wounding, which was each malicious wounding charge is 20 years to life if convicted. So obviously Matthew took a plea deal against our wishes, of course. So he was sentenced to 50 years with 40 years suspended, 10 years to serve in the state of Virginia. You only have to do 85% of that time. But with fighting against the judicial system and knowing the truth about, that at that night, first of all, he lost consciousness when he made the U-turn. So his medical induced issues had a lot to do with what happened that night. And additionally, he was never taken to the hospital. He has a cyst on his pituitary gland that causes him blindness and loss of vision and headaches. So all that, again, was never taken into consideration, and 50 years was what he was given. So here, fast forward, I started petitioning the governor to get a resolution, and we asked for an absolute pardon. We received a conditional pardon.
What did you know about the justice system before this? I mean, was this something you thought this kind of result could happen, or what did you think?
I knew nothing about the justice system. I trusted the justice system. I thought that, if anything was to ever happen to Matthew, that we depended on the justice system to do the right thing and not take a car accident and turn it into a crime. But I have restored faith in the justice, and I have restored faith that, there are second chances in life. There are second chances, especially in the justice system. And with, Senator Edwards' team, advocating for that, I think that we can positively move forward, knowing that we have elected, legislators that can go out there and advocate for, things as such.
Yeah. Well, Karen, I want to bring you into the discussion. Matthew Rushin's case got a lot of attention, and it seemed, so different because of, his autism and just sort of the nature of the offense. But isn't this precisely the problem with mandatory sentences, is that they don't allow courts to consider the individual circumstances of a crime, the individual circumstances of a defendant? Isn't that like one of the key problems that you've seen?
That is the key problem that we see. And with the Ladies of Hope Ministry, we actually work with women that are incarcerated. And what we find is that they don't take in the person, and they're looking at, again, we're hoping that they would look at the nature of the crime or even the mitigating factors that led up to why a person committed that crime. And with us, we are heavily embedded into helping women that are incarcerated, because when you take the women out of the home, you're taking away the breadwinner for the most part, the person that's going to educate their children. And so that is why we are so thankful for Senator Edwards and for FAMM to be working on repealing mandatory minimums here in Virginia. And just to say, what we're finding is that our biggest problem is that when they do sentence, they're saying if you have 7 mandatory minimum charges or convictions, say for example, a mandatory minimum is 10 years, then what happens is if you have 7 of those, they're going to serve 70 years in prison. And with Virginia not having parole, you have to do 85% of your time. And that becomes really difficult. So we are advocating for repealing mandatory minimums on just the basis that it's excessive sentencing, long sentencing, and that, we have to do something to restore our women. And I'm appreciative of Senator Edwards, because it is impacting women of color and African-American communities, and it is destroying our family and our race. And so we appreciate everyone that is locking arms to support ending mandatory minimum. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. I want to bring you in. Americans for Prosperity, if I'm understanding right, is a limited government group, pro freedom. How does this work of eliminating mandatory minimums fit into that perspective? And because I think what it shows is that this is nonpartisan, frankly. And so talk to me about the perspective that you all bring to this issue.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And appreciate you having me join the conversation today. Happy to be here. As you mentioned, right, so Americans for Prosperity, we are a nonpartisan grassroots advocacy organization. And the reason that we're involved in advocating on behalf of criminal justice reform is that we think, especially when it comes to the role that the government plays in this, most of the time, the best thing they can do is get out of the way, right? But there is an opportunity, and there is a part of the justice system that is required for public safety, and individuals should be held accountable when they break the law and when public safety has been violated. But we also need to make sure that we're considering human dignity and second chances and opportunities for individuals to move forward. And really what we advocate for most of the time is to reduce the amount of time and the number of times individuals have to experience or interact with the justice system. And so when you look at mandatory minimums, the problem with that is it doesn't allow for proportional justice. It doesn't allow for circumstances to be considered. It doesn't allow for judges to be able to weigh nuance and everything that has to do in the case. And instead, it creates categorical sentences that aren't proportional based on what was actually committed, and in many cases have nothing to do with public safety. And so unfortunately, a lot of the mandatory minimum laws in the books of Senator Edwards mentioned over 200 in Virginia alone increase the cost and the amount of time individuals are incarcerated, and therefore the amount of time they have to spend within the justice system. Yeah,
well said. Senator Edwards, we all want to be supportive of your effort, and in case, I know we'll get to this question later as well from the audience, what can people watching this who care about this issue, how can they get involved, and what do you think the prospects look like for legislation? Oh, I think you're muted. There you go.
Huh?
I think you're muted. You're good now.
Okay. Yeah, I'm okay.
Yep.
Yeah, it's called lobbying. It's called the democratic process. It's called contacting your legislators and tell them what you think and why, and give the reasons that we're talking about now. There's some people the trouble is, what happened is, it really got mandatory minimum took on in the Reagan administration because of the war on drugs. And it started growing and growing, and it started taking a life of its own. And it's in the 90s. Bill Clinton talked about 3 strikes and you're out type of approach, which is not a good approach either, but same idea. So it took on, and Bill Barr was instrumental in convincing George Allen about some of his approaches of truth in sentencing, supposedly, and all that kind of thing. And so there's now been a long enough time that my light's going off. It's enough time to make sure people understand this is 2021, and it's not working. We need to improve the system. As it's been mentioned, people refer to this country as a life of second chances. I think everybody agrees with that. And mandatory minimums does not give anybody a second chance. And sentencing should be particularized to, some people need to be locked up a long time. I don't doubt that, but not everybody. And every case needs to be looked at as an individual case. Each individual has a distinct issues. The crime itself has distinct issues, and it needs to be particularized so that the way it used to be. And the way the Supreme Court held back in the 60s. Look at the person and look at the crime and make sure it's just. And you can't do that with mandatory minimum. You just cannot do that. It gives certain politicians a chance to say, I'm tough on crime. Okay, big deal. Are you smart on crime? That's the issue. Are you smart on crime? Because that protects the public.
Karen, I want to ask you something. I know somebody's already asked this question in the group. And that is, a lot of times when we get reform, it isn't made retroactive. It doesn't help the people who are in and who are serving these sentences. Can you talk about the importance of making sure that everyone is protected when we can pass reforms like this?
Thank you so much. That is the key word, retroactive, because like Senator Edwards says, like it started with the Reagan era. So we have people that's been incarcerated already 10 years, 20 years, 30 years without any relief. And so if you pass a bill now, that's only going to benefit people in the future. What happens to those that are serving the long sentences? So I'm so glad that you used the word retroactive, because we saw that on the federal level. They have been doing so many different things to end mandatory minimums and the Smarter Sentencing Act and drug minus 2, but they always leave that clause out, retroactive. And so I'm so glad you used that word, because we definitely need a bill that's going to be proposed with the word retroactive so that we can get help for those that are serving long sentences.
Yeah, and to give some context to that, in 2010, Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act to finally reduce the disparity between crack and powder cocaine, but they didn't make it retroactive. And so at FAMM, it was frustrating because we had told the stories of people who were suffering under those long sentences and were able to change the law, but it didn't help the people whose stories we were actually telling. So luckily in 2018, Congress and President Trump even signed it, made it retroactive. We've had 3,500 people get out. Average sentence reduction of 6 years. You know, some people were serving life sentences. So it's really important. Jacob, I want to ask you something. I mean, you know, Virginia's a blue, red, purple. I don't know what kind of state it is sometimes. But I want to ask you, there's a share of conservatives there. What's the charge that, you know, we can't trust judges? We got to be tough on crime. These judges are soft. They're going to let people off. What do you say to that?
I think we should trust our judges, right? I think the reason that they have the ability and should have the discretion is that we believe that they have the ability to make those decisions and to weigh the circumstances. I think the big thing to look at, you know, whether it's taking that decision out of the hands of legislators with, you know, Senator Edwards' bill of making it that we end all mandatory minimums, or, you know, there's also opportunities like I know Delegate Hope had a bill that would have allowed for us to get much better reporting on what the cost of mandatory minimums are and sort of the impact that we see on the human side. And that didn't get seen either. So I think what we should really be trying to work on is again, uniting with everybody on this issue. Again, it's a nonpartisan issue. It's not a left versus right or a blue versus red. It really is something where we want the Commonwealth to be better. And right now, these policies are hurting individuals. They're not making us safer, and they're making it harder for individuals to be able to re-enter upon their ability to do so. And so really, it's a great opportunity, and hopefully everyone takes the charge we've seen at the federal level for Virginians to come together and mandatory minimums.
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, there is not a criminologist on the right or the left or anywhere who supports mandatory minimum sentencing laws. There are politicians and system actors who do, but no one who studies this issue thinks that mandatory sentences work because, as Senator Edwards said, the goal of the system is to individualize the punishment to the crime. Everyone always says, let the punishment, you know, fit the crime. Well, you can't do that if you're straitjacketed with a mandatory sentence. And so no criminologists support this. This is a case where the policy is not following the science. Lavern, I just want to go to you. We're gonna end this panel in a couple minutes, but one thing, cost that I don't think gets included all the time is the cost to the family. Even if somebody's loved one committed a crime and deserve to be held accountable, that the suffering and the hardship that the family endures with someone's absence is really not taken into account. So I want to just ask you what that felt like. I mean, your son's still not home with you, and you know what that felt like when you thought he's facing, you know, 50 years in prison.
I remember just sitting in behind him. I was hand reached, like, literally when the judge said 50 years, my heart dropped. I thought I lost everything that moment, that instant. And as a mom, I felt the pain. We had almost 30 people in court with us, and I felt everybody's heart at that time. And I will tell you, each day he is behind bars. Every minute he's behind bars. We are living that. There's not a moment of the day that I don't think about him, that I don't think, well, what's happening or what's going on. He was they were on lockdown for the past week at Nodaway. And, you know, I was calling the warden's office. I was calling the watch commander's office. We live it. We live it. our community, people that know him, our neighborhood, the boy on the blue bike. Like every time I drive out the neighborhood or drive into the neighborhood, and I see someone, they wave me down and they're like, how's Matthew? How's Matthew? So it not only destroys that person, but it destroys everybody that is connected to him. The autistic community that has learned about him, they're devastated. So it was just heart-wrenching, especially for our family. My immediate family, my mom, my dad, sister, my husband's sister, brothers, it's just everybody has been impacted.
Senator Edwards, we're going to switch panels. I just want to give you a chance to react to that and say anything else before we switch over.
I'll say one final thing, and that is we do have in Virginia the sentencing guidelines. Why do we need mandatory minimum? Sentencing guidelines are supposed to help guide judges regarding the nature of the offense and the nature of the individual. And the mandatory minimum kind of comes on top of that and kind of destroys the whole concept.
Yeah, well said. Okay, we're gonna switch over now. I'll ask you all to turn off your cameras and mute, and we're gonna bring in Commonwealth Attorney Stephanie Morales, Andy Elders from Justice Forward Virginia, and Darlene Wells, who's a family advocate. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to start with you, Stephanie. Good to see you again. You weren't here. I plugged your book the day I became a lawyer.
Thank you. I was here. I was just stuck in the other section. So.
Oh, okay.
For whatever reason.
Well, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I talked about, your work immediately taking over and trying to change this justice system and envision have a new conception of public safety. But, a lot of times prosecutors are the ones who support mandatory sentencing laws because they think they need this tool to make their job easier, to get people to cooperate, to avoid trials in every case. You have a different take. So can you explain to folks why that is?
Yeah, this is, mandatory minimums are truly just harmful. They don't serve any real purpose in terms of safety, which is what we like to discuss when we talk about incarceration. But the reality is that we see that we have a problem with mass incarceration. And we truly have to look at why we're doing the things that we're doing them and what purpose are they serving and what's the impact on our community. And the only real impact of the over incarceration is, the disjointedness of families, a overuse of resources. We don't have unlimited resources. We're hearing conversations about defunding the police, not enough conversations about defunding incarceration. But we're spending so many resources. We're tearing families apart. We heard, what a mother goes through just on the previous panel every day as her son is incarcerated. And truly, there are no real answers as to why some of these scheduled offenses are in the mandatory minimum category. And so, we cannot continue to do things arbitrarily. We have to look at the harm that has been done and end the harm going forward. And again, I am in favor of doing this retroactively so that we reach back and try to undo as much of the harm as possible as we can. So that's the fastest answer that I can give. But the overarching thing is that this system right now is operating as it was designed to operate. I don't want us to be in this fantasy where we feel that, oh, there's been a mistake. Oh, this isn't what we wanted. No, this is exactly how it was designed to operate. And we now have to have the conversation about how we transform it into what we truly need for our society in order for all of us to thrive. And again, for us to see safety, because this is not resulting in safe communities.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think this debate sometimes can get bogus about who's for public safety, as if any of us care less about our kids than anybody else does. We all want safe communities. And so it's just a matter of what works best. Now, I'm going to go back to you again here, because most of the time it's prosecutors who are saying this. So, and I have daughters too, so I know you're going to get interrupted. Let me ask you, how do you do the job? You hear prosecutors who say, I can't, guarantee public safety if I don't have this tool. You're doing the same job they are. So how does that happen?
Yeah, because we're not going to incarcerate ourselves into a safe community. That's the bottom line. We have simultaneously too much crime and too many people incarcerated. And so obviously incarceration is not working. We really truly have to invest into community. And so while I'm focusing on, yes, the violent crimes, that we have people who are murdered, while I'm focusing on police accountability, really doing things that will keep the community safe through prosecution is one thing. But when we're arbitrarily locking up people who have addiction issues or who have mental, health related crises that are not being addressed in the community, when we are engaging in these school to prison pipeline type behaviors, surveillance in public housing communities, people being charged with trespasses because they're walking across the grass. These are things that are happening very commonly. And prosecutors are not taking a step back and saying, why are we trying to prosecute our way out of things that should be addressed in the community? And so I am not uncomfortable discussing the fact that we have to shrink the footprint of this criminal legal system on people's lives. And we truly have to commit to serving beyond that courtroom capacity. I am elected not as a prosecutor first, but as a public servant first. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how to reallocate resources back into the community so that we're addressing things the right way and that we have conversations about the fact that, yes, certain things should be prosecuted, certain things deserve our time and attention, and our efforts, but other things need to be addressed in the community. And we have to have conversations, again, about second chances, about ending mandatory minimums, about what we should be doing and what we should not be doing. Because again, I don't believe in the way the system is currently structured. And I don't believe that it is, going to truly benefit our communities and keep us safe.
Thanks for that. And thanks for being here. Darlene, I want to bring you in because it's another perspective of somebody who's been directly impacted. Can you tell us a little bit about your friend Jesse and what's going on with him and what's the prospects for getting him out?
Sure. So Jesse is serving a mandatory minimum life sentence for a nonviolent drug charge. At the time that he was arrested, the mandatory minimum he was prosecuted under the Kingpin statute. It was a brand new minimum mandatory law in Virginia. He was the first one convicted under that. And no disrespect to prosecutors, but the prosecution was they were very anxious to get someone under that new law, is what we feel. And so he was given a mandatory minimum life. There was, matter of fact, the feds rejected him as far as indictment because there was just no proof. They had none. And the state says, well, we'll take him. And so he was successfully prosecuted and he was sentenced to mandatory life. No violence, there was no drugs found, there was no videos, there was no evidence whatsoever. And he is currently on his 17th year of a life sentence for that.
Jesse's African-American, is that right?
Jesse is a Black male, yes. And at the time of his prosecution, not the whole jury wasn't a white jury, but predominantly a white jury. And Jesse tells me a story when he walked in the courtroom, there were just Civil War memorabilia all in the courtroom. He just knew at that time, this is not gonna go well. But it was the mandatory minimum. He has filed a clemency a petition for clemency. And that's been in a little over 3 years now. So we're just waiting to hear with that. And like Lavern had said before this, I had no idea what criminal justice reform was, never heard of it. I mean, knew of it. But another unique perspective is that I worked in the Department of Corrections for 4 years. So the facility had over 1,000 adult males in a level 4 facility. So I heard so many stories and it really opened my eyes to, wow, I had no idea that this was an issue. So now we are advocating for Jesse, of course, but for mandatory minimum, second chances, yes, definitely. And it's such a prevalent issue that that we're trying to bring to the forefront.
Yeah, well, I mean, we know you're active with FAMM, and I just want to thank you because it really does take people to just learn about the broken system and then take action. A lot of people hear about it, but then just think it's somebody else's problem. But
Exactly.
If we all work together, we can fix this. Andy, I want to bring you in for cleanup here. You see this from the opposite side as a public defender. What do you see of the impact of mandatory sentences and these long sentences, truth in sentencing, from your perspective?
So there are really two impacts because it affects and warps both ends of the criminal justice system. The first is that I represent clients all the time who are charged with mandatory minimum offenses, some of them 6 months, some of them 2 years, some of them mandatory life sentences. The purpose of the criminal justice system is to determine whether or not someone committed a crime. And the way we're supposed to do that is by having trials. Sometimes the evidence is so overwhelming on one side that the defendant decides they want to plead guilty. And sometimes the evidence is so poor that the prosecutor gives up and nullies the case. But in the absence of one of those two things, a trial should happen. In many cases, and especially in cases where there are mandatory minimum sentences, the system structures things to intimidate and coerce people out of their trial rights. And what that means is that people end up pleading guilty, sometimes when they have an explanation and they might be guilty of a lesser offense, sometimes when they're guilty of nothing, sometimes when they have a defense that the jury may or may not agree with or believe. But that's what the system is supposed to do. The system is supposed to make the prosecution and the police put their facts on, let everybody ask their questions, let the jury or the judge decide whether or not the person's guilty, and then decide what an appropriate sentence is. But that all goes down the drain when there's a mandatory life sentence or when there's a 10-year mandatory sentence, because it creates such an air of intimidation that the defendant, the accused, is too afraid to exercise their trial rights. And as a result, we don't know the strength of some of these cases. We don't know what a judge or jury would have said. In some of the cases, they probably would find the person guilty. In many of the cases, they might not. But that makes this criminal justice system not work the way it's supposed to. And that's a big problem. On the other end, we see sentences that are patently unfair. And we see cases where juries and judges literally will say on the record, throwing their hands up. I've seen jurors crying in courtrooms when they learn what the sentence they have to give. And it creates this situation where the jury or the judge, having heard all the evidence, knowing the facts of the individualized case, aren't allowed to exercise their discretion. And really, to put a finer point on it, the law bars them from being merciful. And what kind of law prevents human beings from showing mercy? And to me, that is the core of the two cores of the problem, I guess, with mandatory minimums. They don't work. We should get rid of them in every case. And I hope that we get down that road tonight.
Yeah, I don't think people always understand that. I testified against mandatory sentences in the Pennsylvania State Legislature, and I had the high honor of testifying after a famous criminologist who's recently passed away, Mark Kleinman. And he said to one of the senators, you would have no problem seeing the ethical dilemma if we said to somebody, plead guilty and cooperate or we'll break your arm. And yet for most defendants, they would much rather a broken arm than 10 years in prison or a life sentence. How often do you see the coercive effect of a long sentence being threatened?
It's there in every case. It's not as though there's a switch that you flip and then it immediately has the effect. There are some cases where the person is particularly courageous and they're willing to take the chance, or maybe they've already lost so much in their lives that they feel they have nothing left to lose, and so they're willing to take the chance. But in many cases, the prosecutors have so much leverage, and if they choose to use it, if they choose to charge the offense this way, and if they choose to indict the case with the language that carries the mandatory minimum, that gives them extraordinary power. The system, look, the reason we have criminal laws is because we know people are imperfect. We should not pretend that police or prosecutors or defense attorneys or judges are perfect and that they're going to use whatever power you give them in a way that is morally correct or ethically correct. And
yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I always say to somebody, if you were writing an essay, you'd want as many people reviewing it as possible because somebody's going to catch an error. And our justice system, our separation of powers could do that. If the legislature would set a range of punishments, if the prosecutor could bring the charges they thought were appropriate and recommend a sentence, and then the judge had an opportunity to weigh in, you want all those system actors to weigh in so you can sort of get rid of bias and prejudice.
Exactly. And as Senator Edwards said, what we've essentially done is taken the legislature and let them say, I don't know the facts of the case. I don't know any of the people involved. I haven't heard anything, but I know what a fair sentence is better than the citizens of the county or the city that are watching the trial and have heard everything. And it's preposterous. It's terrible policy. And it's really having a negative effect up and down throughout our system.
All right, Ms. Morales, back to you. This is, how do you do this differently then? I mean, how do you, there's, I don't want to say bad people out there, but there's people who've done bad things. And there are some people, who need to be removed from society because they're a threat to others or themselves or whatever. How do you distinguish those? And what do you say to lawmakers who say, we have the answers?
Wow. So one, I have to start by saying, everything that I do as a prosecutor, I have to do it rooted in the knowledge that my profession has done so much harm. And so, Darlene, you don't know it, but when you said no disrespect to prosecutors, that made me cringe, because people in my profession and in law enforcement have been treated like divas for so long that people feel like they have to say, oh, no disrespect to prosecutors or no disrespect to police. But the reality is that prosecutors and police have not earned the respect of community members to where you should have to feel the need to say that. Like, some people have not earned that respect for you to say no disrespect. So as long as I'm on this call, please don't feel the need to say that around me. I'm working very hard to earn the trust and the respect, but my profession has not done that. So I have to stop and acknowledge that and say that before I can go anywhere else. But in that same train of thought, that's where I come from with everything that I do, and I ground myself in that. And so, like, I have this commitment on a day-to-day basis, on a case-by-case, person-by-person basis, to try to get this right by every person. And every morning I meet with my full staff, and I remind my attorneys most days, like, hey, don't forget, like, these are not case numbers, these are not files, these are individuals, these are lives. And when we don't look at it that way, we miss so much. And so, like, it's not, something that I can put into place as like a policy mechanism that will be a magic fix. Literally, yes, there are things and forms I have in place and all this stuff, but like, I am requiring my attorneys to be so committed that on a case by that every single person that they touch, they understand I don't just represent victims or witnesses. I represent the entire Commonwealth of Virginia, which means those who have been accused of crime, which means that I have the responsibility, to review every single element. I have an ethical obligation that if these elements are not met, I should reduce this charge or I should dismiss this charge. And if it's appropriate and there is a mandatory minimum and I don't feel that it's appropriate for this person to be exposed to that, I have prosecutorial discretion. And so that's a very important conversation for us to have. Prosecutors have been using discretion forever. Now it's becoming a hot topic of conversation because more progressive-minded prosecutors are using it to dismiss things and are using it to not go forward and are using it to reduce charges. And so we have to be so committed that on a case-by-case basis, every single person we touch, we are willing to reduce that charge to something that does not expose this person to a mandatory minimum. I'm so sorry, but if you're on your third offense of selling marijuana, with possession with intent to distribute, you should not be subjected to 10 years of prison or whatever it is on it. I'm not looking at the schedule, but it's something like that. That's a mandatory minimum that is so grossly inappropriate. That is not a crime that is, inherently dangerous, and it's not going to make our community safer to lock somebody up, take them away from their family, and for this community to pay for incarceration for 10 years for someone for selling, distributed marijuana, something that in other states, is legal to do. And so we have to have these conversations now, and we have to really be honest. For me as elected prosecutor, as an elected official, I have to be honest with my community about how I feel and about what's really going on so that they can decide if I'm the person that they want for the job, because I'm change-minded and I want to see us get this right. And I'm committed to doing it on a case-by-case basis. And like, now communities have to hold accountable and ask these questions to make sure that prosecutors are willing to use their discretion to get this right. And so I know that's not a clean and easy and clear-cut answer, but this is not a clear-cut process because we don't have legislative change. And so I'm an advocate for legislative change, but until I do, I will be in the trenches every single day trying to do what I can to get this right with my discretion.
I want to mention, because there's some questions coming in and people joined us late. if you want to get involved in the fight for mandatory sentencing reform, just generally text FAMM, F-A-M-M, to 21333 to learn ways that you can get involved. And I know there's some people who mentioned they want to share their stories. You can do the same thing. Text FAMM to 21333 or go to our website, famm.org, and you can share your story there, because we would like to highlight examples of cases where the mandatories are out of whack so that we can show lawmakers that this is not a theoretical problem. This is something that happens. I'm going to ask, you just mentioned it about fighting for change. I think that a lot of the prosecutors now who are approaching things differently can make a big difference. I also think, you know, when you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And I think if you're there for a while, not you, but others who have come in with the best of intentions succumb. You know, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so I think we need systemic change. We need to sort of take that power away so the temptation to use it isn't there. What are you and others doing, or, you know, willing to do to help us get mandatories off the books so that, you know, your successor, who may not be as enlightened as you are, doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past?
Yeah, so we have, in Virginia, formed a group called Virginia Progressive Prosecutors for Justice. There are 12 of us who are, founding members of this group. But interestingly, the 12 of us represent over 42% of the population of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Wow.
So while we have over 100 Commonwealth attorneys in the state, and traditionally our, the Commonwealth Attorney Group is lobbying against these change and reform-minded issues, the 12 of us are like, no, that's it. We have to do something on our own to represent our constituents. Again, over 42% of the population of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And, we have very specifically advocated for things that we think will result in transformative change. And so that's one thing that we've done. We have lifted up our voices as a unit to address these issues, to confront them head on, and to really try to see legislative reform, and to, uplift the work that we're doing individually to say, this is what is happening. This is what we are accountable to our communities to do. And you should know that this is a possibility, again, so that people are educated about the power that we do have. Because what I don't like, and this is one thing that I've seen around police accountability, one of the things I did very early on in my first term in 2015 and 16 was I prosecuted and convicted a police officer for killing an unarmed teen, and in my city. And what I hear oftentimes is the law doesn't allow us to do this. Well, it's not true. It's been done. And so, there are things that we can do with our discretion and with our advocacy and with our fight within the confines of the law until we can get legislative reform. So my answer is we need elected officials who will fight at every turn, whether it's advocacy, whether it's within our discretion, or just to put our fight, and our boots on the ground to express our commitment for change. We have to do what we can. So I'm committed to this fight with you guys in any way that I can. And I suggest that everyone hold their elected officials accountable to fight in that very same way.
And do you want to react to that, or do you want me to ask you a question?
I mean, I want to react to that by clapping. I don't think that makes for good Zoom, but I mean, I think it's fantastic, and it's exactly right that it's not just people in power that make these decisions, and people in power don't make decisions until people push them. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and every one of us needs, if we care about these issues, to tell our elected officials what we think, but also to tell the people that tell your friends, tell your family, help them understand these things, to bring them around, because that's how change happens, little by little.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that, Darlene, because I know so many people, when they first reach out to us, they feel so alone. They feel like they're facing this system that is so impersonal. It feels cruel. To have a loved one, you can't get answers from these systems. I know people have talked to us about pushing for independent oversight of prisons in Virginia and elsewhere, because these are they say sunlight's the best disinfectant, and our prisons are the darkest places in our country. We shut them off, usually under the guise of safety, but it really prevents there being transparency, accountability, all the things we demand of other government agencies. But just talk to me about somebody who, wasn't, informed about these issues, and how can an individual make a difference?
Like you said, it's get involved, and you have to search for groups or just a starting point. And it's amazing because joining FAMM or being a part of FAMM has opened my eyes to so many other groups that are part of criminal justice reform and pointing out, the things that are wrong. People would not believe what goes on in a prison. You just wouldn't, the stories you hear, there are so many, and you feel overwhelmed. Like, I'm a nurse, and so I feel like I have to help everyone. And when you're in that position and you can't help anybody and you feel so lost, the groups like FAMM and other ones like that advocate, they're just such a wealth of information. And it's talking to your family, to your friends. It's, you may seem like they're like, I'm not sure about this. But once you get involved and once you see the injustices, just like with Matthew Rushin, once you see these things happen and then it actually happens to you, then it becomes more real. There's just so many young, bright men, women also, that are in prison that have so much to give and so much to offer. And second chances is the other aspect of this that I wanted to talk about, because so many people where, we have people who are in college who accidentally, or however they happen to become prisoners. They were in college that are college graduates who were successful people, and under certain circumstances, they have just become part of the justice system, unfortunately. But they have so much to give. And a prison is not the place to get a lot of education or there's not a lot of opportunity. I know with Jesse's case, if you have a life sentence, you're almost put at the bottom of the list because, you're not going anywhere. So we'll get you on the list for education when we can. And so there's just not a lot of opportunities for them to do that. But there's just so many bright people. There are so many good people that are incarcerated that deserve a second chance. The mandatory minimums just eliminates that. Especially a life sentence, a mandatory life sentence. That's really a death sentence that you're living. You might as well say you're going to death row, but you're going to live every single day. And we don't know when your date of death is going to be. So they call it what it is. It is a death sentence. So second chances too is something that really, that I'm passionate about also. So many people deserve it. It's just not given enough.
Yeah, and I just want to make a shameless plug here that FAMM is pushing a broader agenda. I mean, mandatory minimums is an appetizer here, but we do need second chances in the federal level and the state level that include things like compassionate release, clemency, things that we address these extreme sentences where we see the worst in racial disparity, frankly, because of a lot of the policies of the past. I want to ask you, Andy, because you're in court all the time. So to those who say we can't trust these judges, to mete out fair punishments, I mean, you're in the front lines. What do you say?
So it sort of raises the question, what's a fair punishment?
Right.
If you think that a punishment should be more severe and a judge thinks something different, or in Virginia, a jury thinks something different, 12 people who heard the evidence, as a society, it's my position that we should always err on the side of incarcerating someone less. If reasonable people disagree about what a fair sentence is, well, should we err on the side of putting someone in prison longer, charging us more for every day as a society that they're there, ruining their lives, their families' lives, and the risk that we're over punishing them or under punishing them? Should we be the kind of society that says, let's give this person another chance, let's hold them in jail as long as we can? Are we the kind of society that says that we want to err on the side of mercy or on the side of cruelty? And I don't think those are hard questions.
Well, and I think you even brought up an interesting point too, which is not just about mercy or toughness, but who knows, except for the people who hear the facts of a case. I mean, what mandatory minimums say is a bunch of politicians, maybe 30 years ago or 20 years ago when they wrote this law, could foresee the circumstances of every case that's going to come before them. And so they're able to bind judges, whereas juries, judges, they hear the facts of each case. And no two crimes are the same. No two defendants are the same.
And it's not like it's even easy for them. If you're a judge or a jury, you could have two people hear the exact same facts and have completely different ideas about what an appropriate punishment is, just because they're disposed differently. And so there's already so much randomness and arbitrariness in the system. Why inject a floor of punishment that no matter what happens, no matter who the accused is, no matter what the circumstances of the offense, you're not allowed to go below it? It's terrible.
Well, I'm going to bring everybody back, and then I have another question for State Attorney Morales. Thank you, everybody, for hanging in there and for being here. I think what most people, this is my bias, is that most people think of the criminal justice system. You always see the polls. The top priority they want is safety. They think that they want to make sure that the system keeps them safe. There are other important values, but that's what they think about. But I want to address the issue of race because, you know, this has been a summer where we've seen racial bias and discrimination and racism, frankly, in the system manifest itself in ways that have convinced more of our fellow citizens that it's a problem. And so I want to talk about the impact of race on mandatory sentences and just prosecutorial decisions on who to charge mandatory minimums to and how that manifests itself. And, you know, I'm going to just go to you, Stephanie, just because, you know, I know you've seen this and I know you've addressed this. So can you start us off?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying, yes, we have systemic racism. That's the first thing I will just acknowledge that. And we do not do enough as a system to eradicate racist actors from the system. This is probably one of the first times that I have, you know, seen real discussions take place around racism. You know, period. Not even just in the context of the criminal legal system, but because of the events that have taken place in this country, it has driven many in our country who are, you know, Black, people of color, people who are anti-racist is what I will call it. Anyone who is anti-racist has gotten to a point of frustration with racist actors, and we are now having conversations that we've never had or been able to have before. And so now I want, you know, I take that opportunity to discuss the fact that it's not, you know, an accident. It's not, you know, again, it's something that has been, it's embedded in the history of our country. It's embedded in this criminal legal system. And I heard someone draw an analogy to baking a cake, where if you have baked a cake, you cannot, you know, later take that cake apart and remove the eggs and the butter and the flour out of that cake once you have baked it. It's there. And so we have, you know, systemic issues with racism in every system, including the criminal legal system. And we cannot eradicate it or get it out unless we decide to transform it and tear it down and really examine these issues and why they're coming about. But we truly have, you know, also a lack of representation. As a Black woman elected prosecutor, I think I represent now 2% of elected prosecutors around the nation. And, you know, what that says is that there is underrepresentation of the people who are making decisions about what will go forward. And so if you take that and you break it down, in Virginia, we also have a magistrate system. So we have so many different levels where the members of the community who are being charged, they're being looked at by police who, again, oftentimes are surveilling communities of color. They're inside school systems. There's a heavy interaction with Black people, with people of color, with marginalized communities, with poor communities. That heavy interaction leads to more charges. Those charges, when you interact more, they become more severe. You're subjected more heavily to mandatory minimums. And so it's very basic. We don't have, you know, again, those resources to really examine why we're doing things this way or how to change it. Like I don't have, you know, I don't hear conversations being had about at the outset of hiring police officers, what are we doing to ensure that they're not racist? You know, are we asking questions? And so this is such a deep issue. It's hard to discuss it in a short time frame, but I just have to, you know, acknowledge, yes, it's there. Yes, it's present. No, the system is not doing enough to address it and eradicate it. One of the things that, you know, we have seen continuously is we know that the ratio of Black people who are incarcerated in comparison to the population is indicative of what is happening. We can, you know, we can look at it from that hindsight 2020 standpoint because the data is there. So we know that people are being incarcerated at a higher rate. We know, you know, I have looked at and examined data that shows that people have addiction issues at the same rate across all races. We saw what happened with the crack and cocaine epidemic with Black people before. We see what is happening now when there is an opioid epidemic now. And now that it's affecting white people, it's being treated differently. And so we have to discuss these things. We have to get them out in the open so that we can address them. That's the first step. but we have to have legislative reform too that addresses it. And again, one thing to do to address it is if we know that it's disproportionately impacting one community more than the other, we look at why, but we eradicate the problem in the first place, and we look at why there is so much interaction with those communities in the first place and address that. So I know that's a lot real fast, but this is not a simple issue, and it's not something that can be discussed in a short period of time and do the conversation real justice.
Yeah.
Kevin, can I say something real quick about systemic racism?
Yeah.
So the biggest problem here is that even people of goodwill, people who want to do the right thing, who are prosecutors, who have this power, find themselves without a reliable metric to decide who deserves not to get the mandatory minimum and who doesn't. And so, for example, if you're thinking, well, does the person have a prior record? Well, how much is that prior record determined by what breaks they might have gotten in the past, by how much their community was being policed, by whether or not their car was getting pulled over? Or, do they have a nice fancy lawyer who's making a good argument to me? Or are they stuck with some poor public defender? Sorry, that's a little public defender joke. Sorry about that. So, if they're there with a fancy lawyer and it signals to them that this person's someone important in the community, how much are we measuring that based on our own racialized view of who is important and whose work is valuable? All those things are baked into the cake, as Ms. Morales was just saying. And there's no way, even for people who aren't racist, who even want to be anti-racist, who have this power to know when it's appropriate to exercise it and when it's not. And that's what systemic racism looks like when you pair it up with something like mandatory minimums.
The question of, Kevin, you raised, people think of the criminal justice system as mostly about safety. It's about safety. It's also about fairness, which is the key part of the Anglo-American criminal justice system. It's been said that in the Anglo-American criminal justice system, that we'd rather 20 people who are guilty to go free than one person who's innocent to be wrongfully convicted. And we don't think of it like that now. I think we've turned safety on top of fairness, but the system doesn't work. I've often thought this, and that's both perceived to be fair and in fact is fair. And that's something we need to talk more about. You see this, for example, 3 times as many people of color are locked up in our criminal justice system in Virginia alone than white people. It tells you something. It also, as Andy mentioned, are we taking into consideration the background of the person? When I was in the Marines also, and in my experience in dealing with the criminal justice system, most of the people who are locked up, I think I've read 80% have a mental or emotional problem, many times going back to early childhood. People who are abused as children end up being abusers when they grow up. And it continues, it's a cycle. And we recently passed, I'm very proud of this, a bill I had that expanded the criminal CIT program, the Crisis Intervention Team program, to make sure all law enforcement officers in Virginia are trained, it's both, whether with the CIT Crisis Intervention Teams, which is a longer program, but at least with the a minimal amount of crisis intervention team training. And that has to do with people, crisis intervention teams trained to deal, to train law enforcement officers to detect signs and symptoms of mental illness, for example. And the number of people in the criminal justice system that have a mental illness is staggering. The national record, I think the national figure is 16% of the people in the criminal justice system who are locked up have a severe mental illness going undetected and untreated. That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's a huge number.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm glad we got that bill passed. I'm very proud of that. But we also, dealing with the racial disparity, the governor just ceremonially signed the other day the Breonna Taylor bill. And that has to do with outlaws, one of the 3 states, I think, in the country that have outlawed no-knock warrants. No-knock warrants didn't exist for the most part until the 80s. And again, it has as a function of the war on drugs. You'd rather not have bust into somebody's house so they wouldn't flush it down the toilet as opposed to knocking and announcing yourself. And now we require that you announce yourself. You can do it quickly, but we've outlawed no knock warrants. I think that's one of 3 states, I think, in the country that's actually done that. So we're very proud of that.
I want to use the moderator's prerogative to make a couple points. One is, if people aren't familiar, Governor Northam made a statement that he was not going to sign any new mandatory minimum sentencing laws. And so I think that's important, just that, he's sort of on record against this concept that this tool is effective. And so I think that should give us momentum then to say, well, the ones that exist aren't any better than the ones that are being proposed. The second thing I want to say is about on the topic of race. I think that the evidence of racial bias is obvious, but this isn't a hard question, because if that doesn't move you, just know they're ineffective. They don't even work. So whatever your value is that you bring to this, whether it's taxpayer, dollars not being wasted, whether it's public safety or it's racial justice, there's no evidence that mandatory minimum sentences work. We know they positively do harm on race, but they don't do anything else that justify them, even if that was possible. So I'm going to mention 2 other things before I get to the next question, which is comments that we're getting, retroactivity, which we talked a little bit about before, is a high priority for everybody, because most people who take an interest in this topic already have a loved one in prison. And so retroactivity is really important to them. And the other thing I'm going to mention, although I don't know if we want to address now, is that people are always concerned that the focus is on the lowest level nonviolent drug offender, and that mandatory minimums don't work really in any instance. Even the more serious sounding offense, really the more important it is to understand the circumstances of the crime and exactly the role of the person had in that crime, so that we should not reserve our efforts just for the people who committed low-level offenses. Does anyone want to address that question? Karen?
I just want to say something where I want to add in. Basically, one of the concerns that we also have is that when legislation is passed, right, we have to go back to either the court system or we have to go through the parole board. And that often seems to be very difficult, like especially now Fishback was passed and the latest news came out that 150 people went up for parole and only 8 was granted. And so when we talk about legislation and like you said, low offenders or again, nonviolent offenders, we want to make sure that we do legislation that is automatic, because if we have to bring our loved ones back through the whole process of even going back to court or applying for release, it becomes a problem. And so number one, we want to thank, first of all, Governor Northam for even having this criminal justice agenda, because he's doing an extremely great job, but now we need key players that are in place to make sure that we start to release, especially with this pandemic. And Kevin and I are very familiar with each other because we have done things on the federal level, but we have to bring compassionate release here into Virginia, because as you know, the virus is spreading quickly and people are dying. And so our issue as advocates and advocates is that we're trying to get this governor and the Homeland Security and everyone else that have key roles in this to start releasing people, low-level offenders, to save them. Because as you know, this virus is deadly and prisons are not a place to safeguard our loved ones. So that's really what I wanted to say. And yes, absolutely, we need to do something again for low-level offenders, because there's no reason why you have a mandatory minimum sentence. And like you said, they give 10 years for even a gun charge. And our biggest concern is that, again, even with the gun charges, if you have the first offense is 3, then 5 and 5 and 5, by the time you finish, you have an 18-year sentence and you might have only had 12 years for the original charge. And it's not run concurrent, it's often run consecutive. So then you have a 13-year and an 18-year sentence and you're doing a lot of time. And even if you are a low offender with numbers like that, you are spending a lot of time in prison, and it's making you stay in a place that's volatile with other violent offenders. And we just want to try to do as much as we can to safeguard our loved ones, especially like with Matthew Rushin's case. You know, Matthew's a first-time offender and he's placed in a prison population where Matthew's actually had to go into protective custody because you're mixing him as a first-time offender with people that are incarcerated with more violent crimes. And we're trying to do everything we can to continue the fight to get Matthew Rushin out of prison. So thank you.
Yeah, I want to say some people are asking about how to get involved. I just want to mention that we have launched a petition, and that is in the chat for you to see and to share with your networks and loved ones and family. And it's not just because we want your name, it's because what we want to do is enlist as many people as possible so that when legislation is introduced, we can make it easy to, sort of aim and fire you at your lawmakers. So that's the purpose of this. So we want to build that army. And I want to ask you, Senator Edwards, not to put you on the spot, but people are saying, what bill are we supporting? So, when can we expect legislation?
It doesn't have a number yet. It did have a number last year. Senate Bill 5046 in the special session, but it'll have a new number. I don't have the number yet.
Yeah. Okay. So people sign up, and when that bill's introduced, trust me that we're gonna enlist you to campaign for it. And I want to ask Jacob, because I know you're active in lobbying and in trying to build public support for laws. People say, well, what if my lawmaker is not on the Judiciary Committee or is in a position of power? Is that person still relevant? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you have to focus your time, right, the legislators that are the patrons of the legislation, like Senator Edwards, individuals who are the ones who are really making those decisions, are the best use of your time when trying to work with individuals. But ultimately, every bill that's going to eventually make it to the governor's desk and hopefully get signed has to go to a full floor vote in both the House and the Senate. So even if you're not on one of the subcommittees or one of the full committees, you could have good relationships, or you could have a really compelling story or a testimony that's going to really help it when it gets to the floor and hopefully gain some traction from there. So there's no such thing as somebody that you shouldn't be talking to and someone you shouldn't be connecting with.
Well said. And Senator, somebody asked, like, what's effective in changing lawmakers' minds? These are people who want to get involved and they're willing to reach out. They want to know what's most effective in convincing their representatives to support you.
Go see them. Go see them. Write them a letter. Call them on the phone. I mean, people, when we get letters, we read them, especially if it's a handwritten letter or a personal letter. Sometimes mass mailings don't mean much, but write a letter and explain why. And then go see the legislator, the delegate, or the senator. Go talk to them, and go in a group if you have the time. Now's the time to do it because the session's coming up in the middle of January.
Yeah, good advice. And they actually asked about that. They asked about handwritten versus just signing something, and also about visiting. So thank you for that.
Can I just tag on to that real quick?
Yeah.
I want to say that also it's our responsibility to show up to the communities and to places where we are unexpected as well. And so as a prosecutor, one of the biggest impacts that has happened with respect to me and how I operate is beginning to engage inside of prisons in 2016. And I've been doing that, consistently for that period of time where I'm not visiting, I'm not going to observe, but I'm engaging for a full day and hearing about people's life's experiences, what they experience in prison, what their families go through, and beginning to develop that understanding for what it means to incarcerate someone in the first place, and what that process is like, even if somebody's just being taken into jail process and their whole life is interrupted throughout the course of that, experience. And so there's nothing like hearing from personally impacted people. And I don't think, people in my position share enough that it's important for you to have that platform. It's important for me to see my power and take you to a room with me and say, here, you tell your story. I brought you here, take my place, and I'm going to make sure everyone listens to you. So please don't underestimate the value of your voice and the sharing of your experience and what your family has been through, and the ability to incite real change in people and their actions. And again, you have to hold your elected officials and your public officials accountable. If they are not interested in engagement at that level, maybe that's not someone you want representing you and serving you in that way.
Fair enough. We always say we got to change the law, and if they won't change the law, we got to change the lawmaker.
Piggyback off of Senator Edwards, I will tell you my advocacy did start with Delegate Davis. I approached Delegate Davis from the beginning, and I gained his attention, and then I started getting everybody else's attention that I needed to. I even made it from Virginia Beach all the way up to Richmond during session and introduced myself during the autism rally. And I went to every senator delegate that I can possibly go to and knocked on their door and said, here is Matthew's story. Can you please read it? And got a lot of senators and delegates on board. So the way to start is by, introducing your story, by introducing your advocacy and letting them know that you support them. They are our elected officials, and that's the way forward. And that's how I started.
That's great. I want to mention that on the petition, there is a form. I mean, if you get the online petition, there's a place to share your story. So if you have a story that you think is relevant for these purposes to help us change hearts and minds, please share that with us. Attorney Morales, somebody asked if you could repeat the name of the group that you and the 12 others started.
Yes, it's called Virginia Progressive Prosecutors for Justice. I know that's long. We call it VPPFJ for short. We couldn't shorten it. We had so much that we wanted to say.
It's not even a good acronym.
Yeah, I know. But we'll drop. I'll drop my handle, my Twitter and Instagram handle in the chat as well. For anybody who wants to DM, and I can direct message you information about that organization. I think that's the quickest way to do it up here, or you're welcome to contact me at my office. But it's Virginia Progressive Prosecutors for Justice. And we are, we committed and we advocated during the special session, and we're meeting now and are continuing to advocate and will not stop advocating for transformative change.
I can't tell you how important it is to have prosecutors lay down this weapon, because I'm just telling you, in most states that we work in, it's the prosecutors who are demanding mandatory minimums as critical to their job. So for you all to do that is just incredibly helpful.
Kevin, that they were talking about.
And we have to discuss more too. Like, we have to discuss parole. We have to discuss real expungement. There's so much that goes hand in hand with, ending mandatory minimums and second chances. So we're committed to having those discussions and doing this work.
Yeah. This is definitely the beginning. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, we were just talking about advocacy, and there's legislative advocacy, but also the next question is, who are you giving this power to? And there are every year when we have every other year when we have elections for local prosecutors, people go unopposed. And needless to say, when you're unopposed, you're probably going to be doing a lot of the worst policies because there's no competition for your seat. So if you don't like what your local prosecutor is doing, you should call them and tell them, because they're an elected official. And if they're not changing their policies, you should either you or someone you know or someone else in your community should step up and say, I can do this job better. And we should start treating prosecutors just like we treat legislators. They're not permanently in their positions, and they're answerable to the people.
I want to ask, this is a little bit, this is a savvy question. It's, is the recent expansion of earned sentence credits in Virginia likely to have any impact on the possibility of abolishing mandatory minimums? Do those have any connection in anyone's view?
Well, I don't know. Andy, what do you think?
I mean, the answer should be no. They really get at different problems, right? One is discretion about sentencing, and one is, once you're in, what should you get if you do what you're supposed to do? But also, as I was saying at the very outset, the existence of mandatory minimums also affects everything that happens pre-trial. And so I don't think earned sentence credits fixes that at all. There's a number of different problems in how we sentence and punish people for crime. We need 10 bills on how we sentence people. The existence of one or two of them doesn't offset the need for others.
Yeah, people are asking about, how can you find out? Okay, so somebody's asking about how to find out which prosecutors are members of that group. But is it fair to say you have a webpage or something, or what do you have?
I can tell you. I mean, I don't know how, it's, Norfolk, Hampton, Portsmouth, Newport News, in the Hampton Roads area. And then you have Alexandria, Arlington, Fairfax. Man, I'm forgetting. So
you're gonna have to
Rico.
You tweet it.
All right, I'll tweet it. Yeah, I sent you guys my handles. I'll retweet something tonight. I'll send up a smoke signal. So anybody else can send up a
And then
smoke
we'll
signal and let you
retweet it.
guys know who it is. You
Yeah,
guys
yeah.
are trying to figure out whether your prosecutor is in there. I
Yeah.
don't blame you.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Somebody asked a question about how many other states have mandatory minimums, and I just want to say that, most have mandatory minimums for at least some crimes, but I do want people to know that not every system does. People think of Texas as tough on crime. Texas does not have mandatory minimum sentences. Louisiana recently passed a justice reinvestment package that eliminated their drug mandatory minimums. So 30 states in the last several years have reformed or repealed their mandatory sentences. We're proud to be part of some of those efforts. So this is not a new or getting more popular idea. This is an idea that is going away. Mandatory sentences are. And even if you look at the federal level, you had a president who ran on American carnage and law and order, who signed legislation to do away with some mandatory minimums and make those changes retroactive. So this is not, mandatory minimums are not popular. This is the right place to be. There's momentum for repeal. And so, we hope Virginia joins that growing group of states that are getting rid of their mandatory sentences.
We're getting laws changed for the better. They didn't see a huge increase in crime, did they?
No, that's the biggest thing, right? In all the states that saw the biggest drop in their incarceration rate, they also saw drops in their crime rate. And
Yeah,
so
72% of the people polled, I've heard, are against mandatory minimum. Is that right?
well, I think it depends. I think that's generally true. And then when you drill down into which mandatory minimums, but yeah, I think people, they've grown more unpopular. I'm happy to say after 30 years of doing this, we've had some impact on driving up the unpopularity of mandatory sentences. There's other questions that are coming in about social programming and parole and those things. I just want to say on behalf of I think I can say on behalf of the sponsors of this, that this is the beginning, not the end. We don't view mandatory minimums as the only reform that needs to happen. Virginia passed some reforms at the end of last year or at the end of this year, and there's much more to do. We've talked about clemency, other second chances, compassionate release, parole, certainly. So this is the beginning of a second chances agenda. It's not the end, but mandatory minimums is something our groups all agree that is something that we want to do away with. We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to give folks, and I can go around the horn, maybe 30 seconds to a minute, just final thoughts. And I'm going to start, I'll just go in the order that I see you on my Brady Bunch panel. I'm going to start with you, Lavern.
Get out and vote, not only for the presidency, but get out and vote for your local delegates, Democrats, legislators. Those are the ones that are going to make life easier for you. And get out and advocate for what you believe in and the truth.
No, you've done it. You're a really good example of that. And so thank you. And Darlene, any closing thoughts?
Same thing Lavern said, get out and vote. It's not only a presidential election, vote for your local officials. It's very important, and speak out. There are so many organizations, of course, FAMM is the best, but that's a starting point. And then attend the rallies, go visit your representatives. If you have to have your voice heard, you have to speak up.
Thank you. And thank you both for sharing stories. Jacob?
Yeah, as we mentioned, there's a number of really amazing advocacy groups in Virginia that are working on a number of different issues. Again, I'll give the plug for Americans for Prosperity Virginia. In addition to sentencing and reentry programs, we also work a lot on overcriminalization, policing reform, and as well as second chances. And so there's a lot of opportunities to get involved, not just this year, but moving forward. So definitely reach out if you have any questions, and happy to get you plugged in.
Thank you for joining us and for sponsoring this. Karen?
Thank you for having us. We just need bipartisan support. This is a common sense agenda. We definitely need more people that's on the opposite side to listen to us. And we thank you. Please support mandatory minimums here in Virginia. And thank you, FAMM, for everything that you're doing, and the senator and every organization. And Stephanie, I think you did an amazing job. And just knowing that we have a prosecutor that is fair made me really happy. So thank you so much.
Thanks for helping us, Karen. Andy, thanks for all you guys are doing.
Yeah, of course. And as we're stressing, you know, some of the other things that are happening in the criminal justice system, Justice Forward Virginia advocates across the board for criminal justice reform in Virginia. We are staffed entirely by current public defenders. If you're interested in criminal justice reform, in electing better prosecutors, and knowing more about criminal justice policy, do check out Justice Forward Virginia. You know, as a public defender, if you want a good criminal justice system, staff and fund your public defender offices. You know, when you talk to your legislatures, let them know what's important to you.
All right, I don't feel so bad plugging FAMM when everybody's taking their shot. No, you're 100% right about funding public defenders. I agree with that. Senator Edwards, and I just wanted to say, you know, to everyone, but Senator Edwards, thank you so much for taking this issue on, for joining us tonight, for, you know, sponsoring this bill in the past, and we know in the future. So thank you for your efforts.
I think, let me say, we've done a lot this year in criminal justice reform. And one of the things we do need to do is make sure the public defenders are properly funded, especially the court-appointed public defenders, who that's extremely important as well, and not just the public defender system. The main thing is to keep in mind fairness and equity is very important to the criminal justice system, to have support from the community and also to do the right thing by the individuals involved. And so keep that in mind, and by all means, get out there, and I appreciate everything you're doing. Talk to your legislators, write them, sign a petition, and get as much traction as you can, because the legislators don't just do the quote right thing because it's the right thing to do. They are affected greatly by the people they represent. So be sure and talk to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephanie?
I couldn't wait for the tweet, and so I put a link to an article about Virginia Progressive Prosecutors for Justice in the chat. So you guys have that. We've had Newport News Howard Gwynn added on since that article, so there are now 12. But I just want to say thank you, Kevin. Thank you for, you know, everyone who put this on, and, you know, I thank you for uplifting the voice of the people who have been personally impacted by the harms associated with incarceration and mandatory minimums, and, you know, creating this platform, and, you know, lifting up your voice, and doing everything that you're doing to really fight these, you know, these harms that have been done and that are continually being done to people in our nation. And so I will end by saying that I will remain a fighter with all of you. And if there is anything that I can do to uplift your voices further, and to speak truth to power, and to, you know, hold my profession accountable, hold myself accountable, and invite others to do the same, I will continue to do so. You have a partner in me in this fight, you know, for the duration. So thank you, and I'm proud to have been a part of this conversation.
Well, thank you. I'm gonna just say in closing, again, thank you to all of you. And it was great to have a diversity of voices and viewpoints all agreeing on this issue. A lot of times people say, you know, FAMM, go fix this. You know, FAMM, here's the problem. We need you to fix this. There is no FAMM. The FAMM is short for the family, which is all of us who have been impacted by this broken system. We cannot make your lawmaker change their mind. We don't have any magic bullets. It requires you all to take action and to get involved. We can channel your energy, we can channel your advocacy to the right places, but we need you to step up and get involved. And so that means, you know, starting tonight, you share that petition, get your friends and family. Let's grow this opposition to mandatory sentences. We'll work with you to, you know, hit the right voices along with our partners in the state. But we are only as strong as you are, the number of people that join us in this fight. I can't stress that enough. I don't walk into offices and people just change their mind because I have some compelling arguments. They need to know that their political future depends on it. And that means their constituents need to tell them it's important to them and tell their stories. So please get involved. Again, the petition's there. If you want to join FAMM, text FAMM, F-A-M-M, to 21333. Thanks again to everybody who joined us on the panel, and thanks to everyone who's watching. Have a great night.
Thank you.